Mark Zlotlo is helping you, helping your job. You bought a Apple product,
Yeah, new iMac.
iMac, whatever that is. Okay. Good evening, everybody. L'chaim, l'chaim. Okay. So I don't know why camera doesn't seem to be. There we go. Okay. Now this course we've entitled, I believe, the history and development of Jewish practice. And if you come here for inspiration, you're in the wrong place. Okay, so keep reading. I've always felt that that's an important thing. That was my father over there, by the way. Okay. So we're going to tackle something which is very difficult. You have to be awake and juggle many things, and nothing is simple. And so we'll do the best we can, and I sort of embark upon this journey with you with no small amount of trepidation. What I've decided to do is take a look at selected topics dealing with the holidays coming up, starting with Hanukkah, since it's really just in a few weeks, Hanukkah, and after that Purim, which will be soon after that, and then we'll have Pesach soon after that. And Yom Kippur soon after that. It's amazing. It's the way it is. It's incredible. And what I would like to do is take a look at some of the issues involving Jewish practice, not philosophical issues or spiritual issues per se. Everything has some kind of spiritual underpinning, but just on the most sort of practical level in terms of the way Jewish law treats these particular issues and the way these things develop from their sources until contemporary practice. And what I'd like to be able to emerge from this exercise is with an understanding of the primary sources of Jewish practice, of Jewish law, the most important personalities involved in the formation of Jewish law throughout history, some of the assumptions and methodologies used in the process of the development of Jewish law. Now, one could answer all those questions abstractly. In other words, I could give a course on what are the assumptions and methodologies of Jewish law. That's one way of doing it, and there are books that do that type of thing. But we're going to do it more organically, and that is we're actually going to look at these selected issues and analyze the primary sources, meet the personalities involved, etc., and then see if we can distill from the encounter with these texts and personalities what are the assumptions and methodologies. So it's going to be a little rough going, and you'll help me out, okay? Now, the first issue I want to deal with is an issue that is not in the famous issues of the practice of Hanukkah. You know, there's the Talmud discusses Hanukkah in a very limited way geographically, meaning that it's not discussions scattered around the Talmud in different places and hundreds of pages devoted to the topic. Hanukkah is just a few pages in the middle of a tractate of Talmud that deals with something else altogether. There's no tractate devoted to Hanukkah as there is to, say, Sukkot or the other holidays, or Mitzvah, devoted to Purim, etc. It's in Masechet Shabbat, just a few pages there. And it's a very popular passage to teach because part of it is rather easy. And Hanukkah is a favorite holiday. People like Hanukkah, and people like the menorah. They're familiar with it. So the dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, do you light the different ways of lighting the menorah? Do you start with one candle and go up to 8? Do you start with 8 and go down to 1? These are all famous issues, and Mary Lee, when I was discussing with her the content class, she said, "Oh, you're not going to be discussing that old Beit Shammai Ben Hillel stuff, are you?" And so she put the fear of God in me. I wasn't going to do it anyway. So we're going to discuss issues that are not the famous issues. It doesn't mean that they're less interesting, but okay. Now, one of the other challenges, I'm sorry for this long introduction. One of the other challenges in this whole issue is we're dealing with people from all kinds of different backgrounds and levels in Hebrew and Aramaic abilities. So we have Dr. Mark Zlotno with a PhD in Semitic languages, and the highest level of rabbinic ordination, so on the one hand, and then there's me, so on the other hand. So right, somehow we're going to have to be able to, don't worry, he will. So somehow we're going to have to juggle a lot of different levels. I think, I guess if everybody's a little bit frustrated, that means we're doing it right. If everybody is extraordinarily frustrated, then we're in trouble. Okay. Now, in many issues of Jewish law, the place to begin a discussion would be in the Torah itself. Luckily, when we come to the holiday of Hanukkah, we're not going to begin with the Torah itself for very obvious reasons, because the Torah itself does not address Hanukkah, unless you think that there are these sort of hints towards Hanukkah, and there's actually been much written about hints in the Torah itself. When the Torah describes the different stops of the Jewish people in the wilderness, the 25th stop is a place called Hashmonah. 25th, right? 25th of Kislev. Isn't that amazing? And he laughs. You know, one's place in the world to come is vulnerable and fragile. That's a joke. It's okay. He's better off that way. So I was teasing you. So fortunately, to a certain extent, it makes things simpler that we're not talking about verses in the Torah, which get involved in interpreting the verses. That's not an issue here because it's a post-biblical holiday. So the place to begin would be from the Mishnah, right, which is the earliest collection of oral traditions, edited in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Primarily, it was a process, but Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is credited with the chief editing job. So let's take a look at what the Mishnah says about Hanukkah. And I'm telling you right now, you know what it says about Hanukkah? Nothing. So what am I doing? Well, you'll see. So let's take a look at the Mishnah. I'm not going to read the Hebrew text, and you have the English text in front of you. The Mishnah says the following. It should sound familiar to some people. Bamet madlikin, bamet ein madlikin. With what do we light Shabbat candles, and with what do we not light Shabbat candles? And it goes on. Ein madlikin, we do not light with, and then it goes on and lists a whole bunch of materials that we don't use to light the Shabbat candles. It's not 100% clear what these materials are. And of course, if you look in the translations, they come up with names. I think the translation I handed out is from the old Sensino, which I think some of it is not even translated. For our purposes, it's utterly irrelevant what these materials are for today's discussion. So I'm not even going to translate these materials. Okay, unless someone has an Art Scroll Siddur, it's actually in the Siddur. That's what I'm familiar, because on Friday night people recite this Mishnah. Okay, but you shouldn't use lechesh, not chosin, lo halach, and not tilat ha'idan. Doesn't matter what these things are. Lo p'litam midbar, lo b'rosh pnei amayim. Whatever these things are, doesn't matter. V'lo b'zephet, you shouldn't use zephet. You shouldn't use shava. You shouldn't use shem and keek, and not Shemen Sreifa, and not Aliyah, and not Chayim. Whatever those things are, not important for our purposes. Now, I think I might have ended the text right there in the English. You have Nachum Hamadi, Omer, in English. Yeah, I chopped it off for a reason. But
I don't even have
you're kidding. Doesn't say with what we like, with what don't we like?
No.
Oh, that's you're looking at rocks. You're looking at the wrong piece of paper. Yeah. See where it says Parshanut on the top there? That's the commentaries. Yeah, I had out 3 different things. There's 3 different things floating around. 3 different things. Okay? There we go. That's why you're confused. Okay? So the Mishnah records things we don't use to light the Shabbat candles. And then the Mishnah records a dissenting opinion. Nachum Hamadi says, Madikim b'chelev mevushal. That we do light with this particular material. B'chachamim rim, and the safe to say, echad mevushal v'cheinu mevushal, whether it's cooked or not cooked, ain't madlik both. We don't like it. Fine. Now you'll see in a moment what this has to do with Hanukkah. Right now it just has to do with Shabbat. Now I'd like to get you to appreciate a little bit about how one goes about studying the Talmud. We first began with the book of the Mishnah. Right away, we're going to take a look at Rashi. So if you take a look now at the sheet of paper that says Parshanut. Parshanut means, commentary. Okay? So that has Rashi's commentary on it. Now Rashi, as I'm sure many of you know, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, tremendously important commentator on the entire Tanakh and on the Talmud. He lived from 1040 to 1105. He was a student of probably the most seminal founder of Ashkenazi Judaism, who was Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. Rabbeinu Gershom, the luminary of the exile, who really, in many ways, planted the whole infrastructure of Ashkenazi Judaism from a rabbinic point of view, and Rashi's a student of his. Okay, so if you take a look at those of you who have the Rashi there, so Rashi says, "Ba'met madikin," with what do we like? So Rashi says right away, "Lasod pitila," that the Mishnah right now is dealing with materials which are kosher for a wick. You see, there are 2 things necessary to make a candle. What are those 2 things? Oil and a wick, okay, or some type of flammable fuel and a wick. So you wouldn't really know it to look at the Mishnah at face value, especially since we didn't translate any of these materials, what they are. But Rashi is extremely helpful in pointing out that initially it's telling you what are the materials which are kosher for wicks, and then he says, Kohane dematnikin mefaresh v'gemara. Now Rashi here is using Talmudic Aramaic here. That's very common. He uses the language of the Talmud itself. There's a lot of Aramaic words. He says all of these things that are mentioned in the Mishnah, the Talmud itself will explain. So that's why I didn't even translate it myself. Right? Rashi says, Rashi holds your hand, and he says, don't panic. I know you don't know what all these things are. Don't fret. In a few minutes, you'll learn the Talmud. The Talmud itself is going to discuss what all these things are. Okay, so he's trying to calm you down. So now, the Mishnah lists a whole bunch of things. Now, about halfway through the Mishnah, when it says, Lo bezefet v'lo b'sha'ava, you shouldn't use this material called zefet, and you shouldn't use the material called sha'ava. Rashi then says, Lav l'inyan ketila. We're no longer talking about wick material at this point. We're talking about the fuel in place of where you're going to put the oil, the fuel, right? These are now fuels. So the Mishnah, we just learned from Rashi, is a list of, first of all, materials that are used for the wicks, and then materials that are used for the fuel. Now, bear in mind, we are not talking about candles like that box of Hanukkah candles that I see on top of that chest over there, right? We're talking about candles that are a container, right? I'm sure, I hope you've seen pictures of these things. It's a little container, and it has a place, a hole in it. You pour in the fuel, and you stick in that hole a wick, and you light it. Okay? A lot of people like Hanukkah menorahs, by the way. We're not talking about Hanukkah right now, but people like Hanukkah menorahs that way, using olive oil and wicks rather than the wax candles. Okay. So what? Now we're talking about the materials that are appropriate for the oils. Fine. Now, I want to take one step back. The problem is, one of the problems in the Talmud is it's not a systematic presentation, at least from our point of view, systematic presentation of anything. You sort of have to know everything in order to know anything. It's like you can't do this at one page unless you know the entire Talmud, really. Everything's all interconnected and all kinds of assumptions. I don't know anything about this mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles. We're talking about lighting Shabbat candles. But there's something important to know, and I'm just going to give it to you. So lighting Shabbat candles, which has a sort of a lot of spiritual resonance, and there's a people campaign to encourage people to light Shabbat candles. But the Talmud discusses the reason for Shabbat candles, and it's very simple. The reason we light Shabbat candles is so there's illumination in the house. That's it. And so on Shabbat, since we're not going to light fire on Shabbat itself, if you don't create some illumination before Shabbat begins, you are going to have dinner in the dark, which is no fun at all. Andy Rubin slaved all day Friday to make a delicious Shabbat dinner. And Marissa is so excited coming home from work and at this dinner that could be waiting for the family, and you sit down and eating in the dark is no fun. You know, everybody knows presentation means a lot when it comes to gourmet cooking. Ask Andy Rubin. So Shabbat, we're supposed to have oneg, Shabbat, delight. Eating in the dark is not a delight. There's also a very practical reason in addition to that. If you cannot see anything, there's a likelihood that you will trip, God forbid, especially if there are little children in the house who put things all over the floor. You can trip over things. You could trip over a child. This is not oneg Shabbat. So that is why we light Shabbat candles. Nothing more than that. Now, based upon this, there are serious discussions in the Talmud and in the later authorities. What would happen if you didn't light Shabbat candles? Very special candles set aside for Shabbat. But let's say give it a modern parallel. How about just turn on the lights? Electric lights. Could that be Shabbat candles? Maybe you can even make a blessing. So that we're not going to discuss that right now, but that's a serious possibility that that's sufficient for that reason we just said. Because Shabbat candles are there to use. They're functional, utilitarian. So far, so good? Okay. Now, I want to know why it is that this Mishnah limits the materials that we're allowed to use to certain fuels and certain materials for the wicks. So, if you want to know the answer to the type of question, that's the kind of question that the rabbis who lived after the time of the Mishnah, after the 2nd century, they had the Mishnah in front of them. And the discussions that went on in the Beit Midrash would start with the Mishnah. And we'd be sitting here learning Mishnah, And Marganit would say, why is it that we're limited in the materials for fuels and materials for wicks? And one of the rabbis would say, I'll tell you why. And that rabbi happens to be Rabbah. So if you take a look at the next passage there, Amar Rabbah, we're now studying Talmud. Okay? Now, Rabbah here, I want to, as we go through Talmud, to briefly place every scholar chronologically and geographically. Before we discuss Rabbah, even though we already said that the Mishnah was edited in the 2nd century of the Common Era by primarily Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but we can actually date this Mishnah even in a more precise fashion. Why? Because it quotes somebody by name, Nahum Hammadi. Nahum Hammadi. And Nahum Hammadi is not the most famous of sages in the Mishnah, but he is mentioned in several different places, and we know something about him. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's much more famous than he is, meaning that he's living at what very important moment in Jewish history. When the Mishnah is redacted, and the truth of the matter is a little bit earlier than that, destruction of the temple of Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, you're Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the famous rabbi that was in the city of Jerusalem, and he realized it was a lost cause, so he wants to make a deal with the Romans, and he has to sneak out of the city, right? He pretends he's dead. Right? That's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Nahum Hammadi is a contemporary. So therefore, we can actually date at least one of the personalities I mentioned in the Mishnah itself to the time of the destruction of the first temple. So we're talking about, you know, years. Sorry, so thank you. Just keep an eye on me, or ear on me, right? Mouth, brain, disconnect. So we're talking about the year 70, the Common Era, and Hammadi wasn't born in the year 70, right? He's probably, you know, well developed in his career by then. So, right? So probably you're going to say 30, Common Era, right? Perhaps he was born around that time. Okay, so we can date that. So now the Talmud is analyzing, or it's recording an analysis of this passage in the Mishnah, and the personality who's mentioned is Rabbah. Everybody see where we are? Amar Rabbah. Okay. Now who's Rabbah? So Rabbah, he died in the year 320 of the Common Era. 320 of the Common Era, and he was the head of a yeshiva in a very famous city in Iraq called Pumbedita. So he's the beginning of the 4th century in Babylonia. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a certain terminology we use to distinguish the teachers that are mentioned in the Mishnah versus the teachers that are post-Mishnah that are analyzing the Mishnah. The teachers that are mentioned in the Mishnah are called, help me out, Tanaim or Tanaim, right? And the teachers that are post-Mishnah, right, after the 2nd century, we call them, right, Amoraim or Amoraim, right? And how you pronounce those words. Now, I want to say something about that terminology because that terminology is telling. Not even sure. This computer, I think, decided to do a scan, so I'm not really even sure we're online anymore. You can now tell off-color jokes and misbehave and things like that, because I'm not sure we're online anymore. Khan, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, we are. Okay. Gotta behave. Okay. So, does anybody know what the word Tanaim really means? Okay, not really. Thank you. Repeaters. Repeaters. Exactly. So the word Tana, the taf in that word, the t sound, so it's an Aramaic word. It's the equivalent of the letter shin in Hebrew. Now the word shonet, right? Shonet, yeah, it means to repeat. So there's no such word as this, but it would be like saying in Hebrew, Shana'im. Right? Those who repeat. Now, how do you say two in Hebrew? Shtayim or Sheni, right? It's the same word. It means to repeat. Lishnot means to repeat. Lishnot. As a matter of fact, the word Mishnah, that's the name of this text, means it's a collection of that material which is repeated. What a funny name. It's because it's very precise and descriptive. Because it's a collection of teachings that are preserved for what reason? Or how? I should say how, not for what reason philosophically. But
somebody memorized it.
Somebody memorized them. Somebody repeated it over and over again. And it was preserved throughout the generations until it's finally redacted into a written text. Okay? And the people that engage in that process of the collection of the text, they're called Tanaim, the repeaters. Now, this is also very important in understanding why the Mishnah is the way it is. I'm going to say something, and even though it's being recorded for posterity, what the heck would I have to lose? You have to have a very high boredom threshold to learn Mishnah. Yes, isn't that not a nice thing to say? It is extraordinarily boring. You know why? Because there's almost no explanation. The Mishnah almost never is self-analytical or self-referential. It just says, like here, these are the materials that you can or cannot use for lighting Shabbat candles. This is the fuel, this is the wicks. Why? I don't know. What are those things? I don't know. There's no explanation. So it's hard to learn Mishnah. The only way you can possibly learn Mishnah without simply making it the equivalent of, God forbid, reading the phone book, it used to be such a thing. You got to watch out for these anachronistic references. Margaret, you're too young to know about this. It used to be something called a phone book. Yes.
I'm your age. Who doesn't know about reading?
Yeah. So in any case, gosh. So unless you're simply mumbling words, the only way to learn it is to learn it with a commentary. Well, it happens to be the big fancy commentary is called Talmud, right? But you can get a book that has sort of shortened versions of the Talmudic commentary. Okay. The scholars who are mentioned in the Mishnah, they saw their task as conservationists. They did not see their tasks as analysts. It's a very important insight. Because think about it historically. These oral traditions were not even supposed to be written down. Right? It's supposed to be oral. But oral traditions cannot be preserved unless you have stability. You know, there are a lot of Native American cultures that had oral traditions. You know where those oral traditions are now? They're gone. Because you cannot preserve oral traditions unless parents teach their children, who then teach their children, and there's a certain amount of stability, right? But if there's dispersion and dislocation, etc., you don't have the stability to preserve those traditions. So once Jewish life starts to utterly fall apart under Roman domination, so the leadership of the period said, well, we're in big trouble right now. We better go into conserving mode. Okay? Yes, this is the origin of conservative Judaism. Can you believe it? Don't laugh. Don't laugh. Okay, but that's absolutely true. I'll say with a small c. This is exactly what we're about. We're trying to conserve. And it's not the time to talk about it, but I think that there are some real parallels in terms of the way, on a modern time, the way conservative Judaism saw itself with the reform on the one hand and radically changing the world on the other. And what are we trying to do? I think that there's actually a lot of parallels there. But in any case, so the Tanaim are preserved. They're preserving, right? That's why, see, the Amoraim, let's talk about that word in Hebrew. What does that word in Hebrew mean? The sayers. they're talkers, big talkers. I don't mean that, I'm being silly, but right, they're analysts. They're trying to understand. So the Tanaim and the Amoraim have very, very different historical functions, and you see that in the text. So Rabbah, the question now, here's the test. Is he a Tana or an Amora? He is an Amora, right? He's going to analyze the Mishnah. He's post-Mishnah, right? We already dated him, right? Died in the year 320. He's also living where? Not in Israel anymore. He's living in, right? I think it's actually Iraq. Wherever Pumbedita was, Persia?
Persia was
Yeah, that's true. Who knows what Persia was? They're like what Poland used to be. And
Persia was
yeah. Okay. In any case, the right, that geographically the Jewish people start to change focus. The land of Israel is no longer the center of Jewish life. Right? It's moving out to Babylonia. So Rabbah says the following: Amar Rabbah, Pitilot she'aru chachamim ein madikim bahen b'Shabbat. Those wicks which the sages said we don't light with them on Shabbat, right? He's referring to the Mishnah. Why not? Did the Mishnah say why not? No. Please, I'll tell you why. Mipnei sha'or misachsechet bahen. It's because the light, and the Rashi actually gives several explanations, which I didn't quote for you here, about what that, it's not such a common Hebrew word there, but something like it flickers. The light flickers. It's not a stable light. Shmanim sha'amru chachamim ed madlikim bahen, and those oils that we're not supposed to use, mentioned in the Mishnah. Why? They don't absorb easily into the wick. Okay. What's this all about? So apparently, in order to have a stable light, so you need a fuel which will absorb, be drawn into the wick effectively, and a wick which will be able to create a stable light. Now why? Why? Okay, excellent. So one of the reasons is the whole purpose is functional. But if you don't have a stable light, you're not going to be able to carry out the function of the Shabbat candles. That's number one. There's also another concern that the sages have. And that is, remember, you're supposed to use the Shabbat candles. Matter of fact, it's interesting. Where do people light Shabbat candles traditionally? On the table. You know why? So you can see the. You actually, and a lot of times nowadays we don't do that for whatever practical reasons, right? Someone's going to light it on it, whatever, on the side someplace. People really should make an effort to go, I don't know, sometime in the course of Shabbat while they're burning, you know what? I didn't plug in my microphone. But I'm just using the microphone of the computer, which allows the microphone. There we go. Okay, whatever. So the people should make an effort to sit by the Shabbat candles in the course of Shabbat to use it. Now, imagine I'm reading the New York Times to the light of the Shabbat candles. Now, the light is flickering, right? It's an unsteady light. Remember what kind of lamp we're talking about. It's a little vessel with oil in it. So, now, we're not used to using those kind of things, but apparently, according to the discussion in all the commentary Talmud, if you want to increase the light is flickering, you want to have more oil pour into it. So what you do is you can lift up the little container and incline it so that to encourage the oil to flow down towards where the wick is, and hopefully the flame will increase. Uno problemo! Shabbos Kodesh, right? That one of the things we don't do on Shabbat is to neither do we create flame nor increase flame. So we're concerned that if it's an insecure light, it's flickering, that a person will, and you're supposed to use it. So we're concerned that a person's not going to think that. I mean, we do this all the time. I go through most of the day without thinking. You're not thinking. So you tilt the candle, right, the lamp, and you have now lost your place in the world to come forever. Okay, it's that simple. Easy come, easy. Okay, so that is the analysis by the Amora, the analyzer of the Mishnah, which is the conservation of this tradition here, but we can use for wicks and oil. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with Hanukkah so far. But let's read on in the Talmud. Everybody ready? So now the Talmud says the following. By the way, it's not now, actually. It's a little bit later, because the Talmud spent a lot of time trying to identify what these materials are. But we're not going to do that. It's not so interesting for us. So, skipping down, the Talmud now says the following. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna said the following. Okay, let's just pause there for a second. Because I think to understand Talmud properly, you have to know something, at least the barest minimum of, well, who's Rav Huna? Okay, so Rav Huna died in the year 297 of the Common Era. And he is also a Rosh Yeshiva. He's head of Yeshiva in Pumpati. Okay, just like Rabbah. Okay, except for at an earlier date. Okay. So talking about Persia or Babylonia, wherever it happened to be at this time. Yeah, okay.
Babylonia is Iraq. Well, Iraq is modern.
Yeah, all the above.
Yeah.
All the above.
Well, the empire, but
Okay, so now Rav Huna here. Let's ask our question. You always have to ask something. Is he a Tana or an Amora? Is he a teacher from the time of the Mishnah, or is he a teacher post Mishnah? Well, we know it's post. I just told you when he lived, right? If he lives after the 2nd century, so he's an Amora. But there's also another clue. Generally speaking, their title. You know, in the Orthodox world now, there's a big hullabaloo about rabbinic titles. Don't start me. So, good, nobody knows what I'm talking about. So, thank God. So, in any case, the term Rav Huna. Tanaim, generally speaking, were called Rabbi. Okay? Why? Because Rabbi meant you had real smicha. Real smicha. Smicha meant, theoretically, that an unbroken chain of handing down the tradition from the time of Moses till now in Israel. I mean, most didn't get to Israel from the time we entered into Israel. Okay? That's theoretically what smicha is. You cannot get smicha outside of Israel. You could be the biggest Talmudic genius in the world, but if you live in Carmichael, then you cannot get real smicha. Okay? Rav Huna was a great Talmudic genius. The only problem is he lived in Carmichael. And so therefore, he gets a kind of booby prize title called Rav. By the way, just as a footnote, there's an interesting kind of quirk of history linguistically. I see this happens all the time. We get flipped upside down. Nowadays, in modern terminology, if you want to show a lot of deference to a rabbi, you'll call him Rav. Okay. And then there's rabbi. I actually have Israelis that sometimes will in Sacramento, they'll call me Rabbi Zev. Like, they'll be speaking Hebrew, and they'll say Rabbi Zev. Like, rabbi? There's no such word in Hebrew, rabbi. Rabbi, that is, how about Rav? So, but it's funny how Rav has become like reserved for like great Torah scholars, and rabbi. Exactly. They'll ask for a conservative. So I guess I'm reformer conservative. So in any case, in real strict terminology, Rav means you don't have smicha, and Rabbi means you do Rav. Okay, so Rav Huna is an Amora, and let's hear what he has to say. Amar Rav Huna. Pitilot ushmanim sha'amru chachamim ein madlikein bahen b'Shabbat. Those wicks and fuels, the oils that the sages said that we don't use them for Shabbat, ein madlikein bahen b'Chanukah, and you should use them for the Hanukkah candles either. Bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol, whether Shabbat or not Shabbat. Now, what does he mean by whether Shabbat or not Shabbat? Anybody got to use that? I thought we were talking about Hanukkah candles. Good, right? Right? Yes, it could happen, right? Depending upon today's day, so you theoretically could have two Shabbatot. So when you perform the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles, so Rav Huna says that the same rules apply to Shabbat candles as to Hanukkah candles. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the Hanukkah candles you light on Monday night or on Friday night. Maybe Shabbat, maybe Shabbat, or the secular. So far, so good? Okay. Now, that's all Rav Huna said. You know what happens? There's a never-ending cycle of ambiguity in Jewish tradition. This is what keeps rabbis employed. Because the Mishnah says something. Let's start with the Torah. The Torah says something. Don't understand it. So the Mishnah clarifies it. And I don't understand the Mishnah. So then a scholar from the time of the Talmud tries to explain the Mishnah. But people who lived a generation or two after him don't understand what he said. And it keeps on going and going and going until the very day. So that would have solved all of our problems. So Rav Huna, who just told us that the same laws which apply to Shabbat also apply to Hanukkah, so nobody knows what he meant by that. I mean, we know what he said, but we don't know why. Why should the same laws apply? They're different considerations. So look what the Talmud now says. Amar Rava. So Rava said, my Tama the Rav Huna. What's the reason of Rav Huna? Why should it be that the same rules that govern the use of oils and wicks for Shabbat apply to Hanukkah as well? Why should that be? Now, I just want to point out, this is how the Talmud segued to talking about Hanukkah. Right? There is no Masechet Hanukkah. This is where we start talking about it. It's just by association, because we're talking about kosher wicks and kosher oil. Since we're talking about that in Shabbat, Rav Huna says that the laws which apply to those materials for Shabbat are the same laws apply to Hanukkah, and voila, we're now going to have 3 pages in the Talmud talking about Hanukkah. You see how that happened? Okay. So Rava is now going to analyze Rav Huna. Now, I would be extremely upset if Rava lived before Rav Huna. Does everybody appreciate why? Because Rava is analyzing Rav Huna. You realize that Rava is doing to Rav Huna what Rav Huna does to the Mishnah, right? Everybody is analyzing the ambiguity of a previous source. So so who is this Rava? Now remember we said that Rav Huna, so he died in the year 297. Rava died in the year 352. So far, so good. And back that way, we're the Common Era. And he was also, Rava was a Rosh Yeshiva, also in, I don't want to have a big fight now exactly where these towns are, Mechoza. Mechoza was also the location of a very important yeshiva in, it says called Babylonia for the sake of Babylonian Talmud. Okay? So Mechoza. That's Rava. I'm a Rava. My Talmud Rav Huna. So what is the reason of Rav Huna? Kasavar. He asked the question, and guess what? He answers it too. Sort of a rhetorical question. He has it, he answers. And here's the answer. Brace yourself. This is going to become very important. Kavta zakukla. Because apparently, Rava says, that Rav Huna must hold of the following 2 principles. What would happen if after you light your Hanukkah candles, they go out? A big wind comes along, blows out your Hanukkah candles.
Can't even kindle.
So, well, do you have to? That's the question here. You have to relight it. Right? We're not talking about can you. Of course you can. But we're not talking about Shabbat right now. Not on Shabbat.
Well, it's almost, so it's not explicit that you can kindle them because it's not Shabbat.
Yeah, so I'm telling you, we're not talking about Shabbat right now.
They've already fulfilled their obligation.
Have they?
You did, right? You advertised.
That's what you say.
Right? And
That's
so
what you
once
say.
it's done and went out, it's already fulfilled the mitzvah.
Thank you, Rabbi. It could be right. It could be that the mitzvah is to light it, so you lit it. 5 seconds later, a wind comes along and blows it out. Sorry, God, that's your fault. I did my part. I lit the candle. So the Talmud says that Rav Huna, who says the same laws apply with regards to Shabbat and Chanukah, so he holds the reason that they're the same is because Kafta Zakupla, that if it blows out, Kafta means the Chabot means to extinguish, Zakukla, it is necessary to relight it. Exactly the opposite of what you just said. That's okay, because there's an opinion that says like you. You know, I used to have my main teacher when I was in Yeshiva in New York, Rav Parnas, so, you know, sometimes he'd ask a question, and people were too embarrassed to say anything. And so he used to say, Rabbi Isai, no matter what you say is right, one of the scholars is going to say your opinion, right? As long as it's not complete nonsense, as long as you say something reasonable, the way the Talmud works, if something is reasonable, someone's going to say it. So, Zev, you'll have your day in the sun, in just a few minutes. But right now, we're saying that that Rav Huna must hold that if the lights go out, the Hanukkah lights, you don't have to kapta zakukla. You have to relight it. You have to relight it. Okay. Furthermore, umutar lehishtamesh laora. He must hold by another principle, that you are allowed to use the light of the Hanukkah candle. I want you to think about this for a second. You see, we just explained a moment ago that what was the function of the Shabbat candles? Completely utilitarian. Use the light. You should go out of your way to use the light. But you know, Hanukkah candles are not there to create illumination. Why do we like Hanukkah candles? Advertise. Very good. Persuminesa, that famous expression. To advertise the miracle. Has nothing to do with utilitarian. So that would lead to an interesting question. Can I use the light of the Hanukkah candles or not? And I'll bet there are people in this room that think that you're not allowed to use the light of the Hanukkah candles. Okay. So, very good. So it could be there's such an opinion. But here it says explicitly the opposite. That's as soon as you start studying the primary sources, you see that nothing is simple. So this opinion holds that you are allowed to use it. Now, I just want to explain this for a moment, why you might have thought that you shouldn't use it. So Andy says the following. You know, since Barry Lee just told us that the whole purpose of the Hanukkah candles is in order to broadcast the miracle of Hanukkah, if I use the lights of Hanukkah, so remember, we're not talking about a Hanukkah menorah like on top of that chest over there. We're talking about little candles, the kind that you use all year round, right? It's just these lamps. Just you line them up, right? First night 1, second night 2, etc. So in terms of what they look like the candles you light any day, any evening. So if I'm playing poker by the light of the Hanukkah candles, right? And this could be very practical because there's another holiday that happens during Hanukkah often, in which it's a mitzvah to play poker on that night. Okay, so you know what a person's going to think? You know those candles that are lined up on the table over there? You know what they're doing there? It's so he can play poker with his buddies. There's not going to be any recognition that that's somehow advertising the Hanukkah miracle. It's just it's lights so he can play poker. So that was good, Andy. That there, I can understand a logic that would say don't use it, but not Rav Huna, according to Rava. He says mutar l'ishtamesh lo. You can play poker by the light of the candle, no problem. Okay, why? Talk about that later. Okay. Now here's the hard part. Is everybody incredibly awake? So I just want to describe what just happened, and then you're going to have to fill in the blanks. We're trying to understand what is the logical basis for Rav Huna saying that the same limitations which regulate Shabbat candles, those same regulations apply to Hanukkah candles. Why should that be? It's not obvious to me. So Rav said, I'll tell you why. Because he holds of the following two views. He holds that if your Hanukkah candles blow out, that you have to relight them. And he holds of the view that you are allowed to use the light of the Hanukkah candles. Can anybody in this room explain to me how those two positions are necessary to explain why Rav Huna holds that the same limitations on Shabbat candles apply to the Hanukkah candles? What does one thing have to do with the other? That was not rhetorical. I was sort of hoping that. Correct. The oils and the wicks, which we're not allowed to use on Shabbat, we're not allowed to use on Hanukkah as well. Okay. So why should it be that the same set of laws apply? These are two separate mitzvot, have nothing to do with one another, completely different considerations. Why should it be that the same regulations apply? So Rava says, just to reframe the question again, it's because Rav Huna, who made that statement that the same rules apply, it's because he happens to hold that if the Hanukkah candles go out, that you're required to relight them, and you're allowed to use the light. So I want to know, what does one thing have to do with the other? That's true.
You can't use them if they go out quickly. If they're going out, then they have an authority.
That's a good point. Mercy, you're about to say something.
Somehow, that if you need to relate them, you have to use them to somehow the connection to using them. They're no longer useful or.
This is tough. Let's take a look at Rashi. Let's see what Rashi, if Rashi helps us here. I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. But you're going to see in a second that there are going to be rabbis who say, no, you don't need to be limited in the materials. You can use you can use materials that produce an insecure flame. So somehow, since there's going to be a dispute about that, we're going to have to come up with principles which are motivating both positions. Well, he's trying to explain. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at what Rashi says. I mean, you'll see when Rashi says things. Generally speaking, this is generally true that he has a tradition that he received from his teachers and so on. It's not. He usually doesn't. Matter of fact, when he makes it up, he usually says so.
Well, I didn't mean it in that sense, but only the not here to be adorable.
Right, because if they were, we wouldn't need Rashi. Right? He's not going to simply repeat what the Talmud says, right? He's trying to help us. So let's look at what Rashi says. So when the Talmud says kavta, right, if it went out, that you in fact have to relight it. So the first thing Rashi does, everybody see where the Parshanut, okay? So Rashi says Ner Hanukkah. So the first thing you have to know is we're not talking about Shabbat candles, we're talking about Hanukkah candles. That's the first thing to get rid of that ambiguity. So if they go out, Zakukla, you have to relight it. So Rashi just explained Zakukla is not exactly the most common way of saying you have to relight it, right? If I go to an Israeli and I'd say Kata Zakukla, I'm not sure they would understand what I'm trying to say. So Rashi has to explain. Zakuka letakna, you have to fix it. Letake, you have to fix it. Hilkach sarich lechatchila la'asot yafeh. So therefore, you should use the best possible, most stable material for the flame. Why? Dilma pasha v'lo metaken la. Because it could be very tempting, but to do what Zev just said a few minutes ago, right? I lit the Hanukkah candle. What do I think in my own imagination? Okay, I did my part. 5 minutes later, a wind comes along and blows it out, right? Or it goes out by itself. If you have very inferior wicks and oils, you don't need the example of the wind. It just goes out because it's a lousy material. So hang on a second. So since Rav Huna holds of the opinion that it is not enough to have simply initially lit the Hanukkah candles, that apparently they have to burn for a certain amount of time in order to ensure that we actually fulfill the mitzvah, let's maximize the possibility that the candle will produce a durable flame so that I'm not tempted to, I look behind me, oh, it went out. So what? So therefore, I'm required to use the best possible quality fuel and wicks in order to avoid the possible problem of not fulfilling the mitzvah because it went out by itself and I didn't bother to fix it. So far, so good? Okay. But there's another principle. What was the other principle that he held by? That you're allowed to use the light of the Hanukkah candles. Now, why is that an important principle? Remember what Rav Huna said? Bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol. That this principle that you have to use the same high quality wicks and oils applies whether you're lighting on Monday night or Friday night. Why should there be a difference? Why is Friday night any different than Monday night if my concern is that I fulfill the mitzvah by making a durable flame? So if that's the concern, why should Friday night be any different? For a very simple reason, because it's an extra concern. Look at Rashi. That you're allowed to use the light. Hilkach, therefore, Shabbat Asur. Therefore, on Shabbat, we have to be very careful to use high quality materials. You can't use these inferior qualities. You know why? The exact same reason of Shabbat candles. Because since you can use the light on Shabbat itself, so therefore, I'm going to read the New York Times by the light of the Hanukkah candles on Shabbat itself. If it's an unstable light, what I might be tempted to do? Read the. I might be tempted to, right? Take the lamp and okay, and have the oil flow into the wick, right? You see, the issue if it goes out by itself and it's Friday night after dark, it's too late. I'm not going to relight it. Right? That's not the issue. So what am I so concerned about? About having high quality lamps and oil. There's another problem. The same problem with Shabbat candles. Exactly. I'll be tempted to increase the oil flow into the wick. Okay.
Yeah, so why is that a problem on Hanukkah?
I'm sorry.
Why is that a problem on Hanukkah?
Because if it's a Monday night,
Yeah.
no problem.
To increase the light.
No problem at all. There's no problem. I'm allowed to light candles on Monday.
Right, you're allowed to tip the oil to get better light on Hanukkah.
But not on Friday night.
Not on Friday night, not Friday.
That's his point. That if I use inferior wicks and oils on Friday night when I live, right, before Shabbat begins, I will be tempted to. That's a different problem. No, see, that's the point here. That there are two separate issues here, right? They coalesce halakhically into one point. You have to use superior wicks and oils. So during the week, let's just review. During the week, what's my concern? My concern is there's a halakha that lighting the candles itself is not the mitzvah. Apparently, it has to burn for a certain amount of time. So therefore, to assure or ensure the chances that I'm actually going to fulfill the mitzvah, use high quality materials. On Friday night, there's an additional issue, and that is that I may be tempted to, because I'm allowed to use the oil, I may be tempted to increase the flame. Okay, so those are the two assumptions that underlie the view of Rav Huna, that whether we're talking about Friday night or Monday night, we want to use only the best possible oils and wicks. Okay, we're going to pause here. Now, I can see there's some furrowed brows in this room, right in front of me over there, and right over there, he just covered up his brow. So, all the questions you're thinking of right now are legitimate questions, and they're all discussed by all the commentators in the Talmud. There are a million issues here. Nothing is simple. I tried to, it might not have sounded simple. I tried to make it simple. I was bluffing. There's all kinds of problems with what I just said. But that seems to be kind of the Derech HaMelech. It's the El Camino Real of going through the passage here. And it has certain problems. All those problems have certain answers. But I don't want to get too sunk in the swamp here and never emerge. So this is what we've accomplished so far. Now you're going to see next week that it ain't necessarily so. We're going to see two more opinions that weigh in on this issue. And each one of those opinions, we're trying to understand what was the underlying assumptions. And then we're ultimately going to ask ourselves, so what is the halakha? Right? For instance, the first issue will be, if the menorah blows out, do I have to relight it or not? What's the halakha? You'll see that that's a dispute. The only problem with the Talmud does not at all weigh in on what the halakha is. It just presents opinions. So how does it happen that you could go to your local rabbi and say, Rabbi, my menorah just blew out, what do I do? And he can give you an answer. Where do you get that answer from? Doesn't say the Talmud. So that's true, that after the editing of the Talmud, so there's sort of an intermediary period there of scholars that are actually quoted in the Talmud. So a lot of accretions went into the Talmud over time, and then you ultimately get to the Gonim, who are not those. Okay, so we'll pause right here, and we will go on Bezrat Hashem next week. Don't forget anything we said. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
There are two Rabbis. One with a head, one with an owl.
Yeah, they're
One
different.
from the guy from the other from the cook.
Yeah, so they're two different people. Yeah, and okay, so I'm going to tell